Hi again, everyone, from Cedar Rapids. I am Bob Ask with my story. My life in historical context, my little world in the big world. Today, in my series of 20 vignettes, it's vignette number 16. I've entitled our thoughts for today, As a Little Boy, My Far Biggest Decision, with Eternal Consequences. Now, my longtime friends already know my reference, my reason for that title, and I hope my new friends from this venture already have an insight as well. My far biggest decision. As a little boy, back in those 1930s, once again, I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. As the song goes, ever since, I'm so glad I'm a part of the family of God. I sometimes kind of wish that I could pinpoint a date or a time or the thrill itself, because others who are saved have told me what a wonderful time it was that they experienced. But I also know that to accept Christ as a child is the way to do it if you can, because those are the tender years, and there's nothing like childhood faith. So I can't tell you when, and knowing me back at that time, I probably accepted Christ many times, although I know that's not necessary. Now, first of all, the place to begin is to check out for Marilyn and me our church roots, where we worship and where we serve. For Marilyn, you already know from past vignettes, Quaker background, little church north of Muscatine, Bloomington Friends, where we were married, going to the Quaker youth conferences at William Penn. You know that story about Marilyn. I came from Ottumwa, the Swedish Congregational Church, until it ended its time and merged into Open Bible. Wonderful church with Reverend Charles Leeming as our evangelist. When we were married in Marengo, we went to Methodist Church. And then 68 years ago, coming to Cedar Rapids, and ever since, we belong to Calvary Baptist Church. Now for Marilyn, when it comes to service, at Calvary, she was 40 years the beginners department chairperson, handling little 2-year-olds. She was a deaconess. She was on the missions committee. She was on the building committee for our new church. And she was in charge of 2-year-olds in Mothers for Preschoolers, MOPS, for 15 years. For me, at Calvary, a long-time Sunday school teacher, mostly with adults, a class officer, a Bible studies teacher for many, many decades at different venues, Sunday school, evening classes, even going elsewhere to other churches as a Bible studies teacher. I was a deacon. I was on the missionary committee as chairman for a while. I was an usher, and yes, I served with Maryland with the MOPS program. In 1 year after leaving Jeff, I went from high schoolers to 2-year-olds. But I don't want my testimony and my example to be within just the confines of the sanctuary, the building. Or as the old saying goes, I don't want to preach only to the choir. Now, how do you do that out in public, especially in my career in the public as a public school teacher? Well, let me explain how that was accomplished. First of all, the way you treat subject matter. There are ways how you handle history that exemplify acknowledging God, even Christianity. There are ways without stepping your feelings in a public arena. So first, a way a teacher handles God. My Bible was on my desk in clear vision all those years. And then how else do you exemplify your testimony? By your demeanor, by your tongue, even on the football field, by your habits, and by your relationships. Because people are always watching. And watching, we want to see good things. I was in charge of the Jefferson Youth for Christ program. And there at the outset of the school, we were able to have a club with the public acknowledgement in the yearbook, our picture. We met every Tuesday morning, Youth for Christ, for several years. John was there, George Heidinger came, Ken Marsh came, other Calvary folk. We had such a good faculty representation, 2 or 3 others, and a quite large group of students, Youth for Christ. I know some of my family have done likewise with the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in their teaching experiences. And then there were the many banquet occasions where I would give the invocation. I was always the one, it seemed, there and in other meetings in town where I was the one who gave the invocation. And then I think the pre-game prayer is important. For 25 years, when I was coaching Jayhawk football, I gave the pre-game prayer. The other coaches, off and on for years after, had me do it to their squads before their games as well. Now, the question comes up, how can you pray for a game? How can you do that? My friend and fellow coach, John Hegarty, has had me featured in an article he's written both in the media guide and in his new book that we'll talk about later on how that was accomplished. He entitled his piece in both of those publications, The Intimate Team Bonding Locker Room Prayer by Bob Ask. He goes on to describe the setting of the team and how they were on bended knee, heads bowed, yielding, he says, to the deference to a higher power. A coach, he said, would give his shepherding prayer. Well, that's how John puts it. He mentions the reflection by many players ever since who remember that. More and more, of course, there are those that would criticize a person acknowledging Christianity and Christ, but here is how I rationalize and explain it in the article in the media guide that John pens about me. He points out how down at Kinnick Stadium, I prayed before the big Dowling game in '72. He points out before the dream game of '65 against Central for all the marbles, another championship game, on bended knee, heads bowed, Jayhawks prayed. Now here is how I explain that rationale and that situation. In short, did my prayer petition God for victory in all these contests, important at all of them as they seemed to be at the time? No, because simply we all recognized that our opponent worshiped God as we did and were of equal consideration in his view. Our pre-game prayers acknowledged God with a special mention of our thankful appreciation for playing and representing Jefferson in what would be memories lifelong. It goes on, we go on to point out how I prayed for protection for both teams from injury, how we would represent good sportsmanship, and how we would both teams be proud of the occasion for which they were able to play. In looking back, I should also add a key amplification on the subject. Notice this. Through it all, I strongly believed that even during little athletic contests, God does, according to his divine will, direct the goings-on and even the scoreboard. To think anything less of God would diminish his power and his sovereignty. Maybe this personal application helps me explain my prayer and athletics contests. Doesn't God listen to his believers in all other occupational pursuits? Doesn't he want the carpenter, the policeman, the farmer to excel and be satisfied? For a coach, part of that comes from, yes, the scoreboard. Notice how I conclude this. I shared all of this in my article here. He is in charge of both victories and defeats, and he knows what's best in both, and I thank him for that experience. Now, as the decades rolled on over these many years, at church, when it comes to my Sunday school and Bible studies, what were some of the topics that I studied and presented? In extended series, I taught the book of Revelation, front to cover, at least a couple of times. I taught the book of Daniel, a challenge and absolutely a favorite of mine, the book of Daniel. I taught the life and journeys of the Apostle Paul, loving the book of Acts because it combines the geographical, the historical, the spiritual side of things with Paul. I taught a lot of end times prophecies. I gave to the retirees on annual occasion a 1-hour presentation on the following: Noah's pre-flood world and the big change, the intertestament 400 years, the silent years between the old and the new, the story of Babylon, ancient Babylon to the future tribulation Babylon, the emerging world religion, Babylon the harlot, the apostate church coming in the future, world politics and prophecy, insight today, looking at Russia, looking at China, looking at Iran, insight even today. We are getting close. Christianity and the church after the first century, tracing it all through the Protestant Reformation. Christians and Jews, what it was like for them living in a Roman world. I make 2 notes of importance. I studied a lot, but all of my works were my own doing, my writing, my organization, my results. And I should also say, just at Jeff, when I utilized visual arts, visual aids, I should say, for explanation and help, I did the same in my Bible studies. In these series at the retirees, I gave a booklet like this one here to each individual so that I could move and cover a lot of material in 45, 50, 60 minutes when it would go over their head just so much if they didn't have something in front of them. This one happens to be the pre-flood world and the first 1,600 years of history and its aftermath. What it was like before and just after the flood and Noah. These little booklets I gave to each individual. We're going to go back as examples to a couple just to give you a taste of what it was like. Bible learning history is fun. But first, I want to acknowledge a good Christian friend of mine whom I've known from when he was a student of mine to now when he is a colleague of mine at Calvary Church. Forrest Moss, who is a scholar indeed when it comes to knowing and studying and representing Genesis and the beginnings of creation. Whenever I came to a question, I got on the phone and called Forrest, and he helped me because I learned a lot from him about what it was like in the Noah world. And especially Forrest explains it so well how things changed with the coming of the catastrophic flood. A couple examples. How long was the pre-flood, the Noah world? Just think, people. The first 1,600 years of creation, using the 6,000-year model, which I think is continuing proof. The first 1,600 years of creation occupied 1/4 of all time. And when you enter the changes that came about with the flood, the ice age, the continental changes in the world and in the waters of the world, another 300 years, it comes up to, just think, 1/3 of all time was involved in the pre and during and aftermath of the flood. The flood happened. It happened, and there are evidences of such. Another interesting tidbit from my Bible studies. Notice I said earlier, I spent 1 hour sharing what went on between testaments at the end of the Old and the beginnings of the New. God was silent. No more prophecies, no more coming from God. What was he doing? He was busy. 400 years, God was getting the world, the first century AD, ready for Christmas. Jesus Christ, his first coming. In that time, those 400 years, you have the Greeks, Alexander the Great, who gave us the language and communication that would help Paul. We have the coming of the Romans, who gave us the world peace and the road system that would help Paul again. You have, during that 400 years, you had the Maccabees, when Israel was, for a short time, independent. You have the coming of the Apocrypha, the Old Testament canonization, and the Septuagint, all crowded into a wonderful 400-year package that I presented between the Old and the New, the Inner Testament story. For fun, a little lesson. An insight that I remember getting from my studies with the great Dr. David Jeremiah. In Romans, there seems to be, at first glance, a contradiction. There are no contradictions in the Bible. You just pursue your investigation. But there are two references about Israel, the Jews, during tribulation, which seem at odds. Now remember, the tribulation is a 7-year period, right down to the day. The days are mentioned in Revelation. It starts with the rapture, when he calls believers up. It concludes with the second coming, when he comes with the saints to start the millennial rule. Now, it concerns primarily Jews. What happens to his chosen people during the 7 years of tribulation? Remember, that's the time of Antichrist. That's the time when Russia makes an initial move called Gog Magog. That's the time that Babylon, the harlot church, finally agrees and moves along with this terrible situation that's going on, the various judgments, the 7 series of different judgment occurring, a horrible time. But in all of that, there's going to be a tremendous revival for both Jews and Gentiles who did not make the rapture. It says in the Bible, multitudes of Gentiles. What about Jews? Now here we come to what that question, that contradiction seemed to point out. Romans 11:26. Romans 11:26 said, all Israel will be saved. But Romans 9:25, 6, and 7 says, only a remnant, some, will be saved. You've got to look beyond Romans to find the answer. Dr. Jeremiah opened my eyes. Zechariah 13:8 and 9 says, at the end of tribulation, 2/3 of the Jews will have perished, did not accept Christ. It points out 2/3 will not accept Christ and will perish. It points out that 1/3 of the Jews will accept Christ, and they will be survivors. So at that point, at the end, the Bible verse says, all Israel will be saved. An interesting Bible lesson. A best way for me to conclude with this. I know not when my Lord will come, at night or noonday fair, or if I'll walk the vale with him, or meet him in the air. But I know whom I have believed and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day.